Hello, everyone. Welcome to Menalesh Meti. This is Menalesh Meti in English, especially today. So I've got you a special guest today. We'll be talking about Horn of Africa and its politics and Ethiopian foreign policy and other stuff. I'd like you to stay with me. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Well, like I said previously, we'll be talking in English, and we have, as you know, most of my programs are in Amharic, but we also have an English section because we want to reach out the other part of the community that don't speak Amharic, and also international community need to know what we think about the international politics and the Ethiopian politics and the rest of it. So I have today Professor Beniam Awash, PhD, an assistant professor at the State of University of New York, Oniota, and Binghamton University. He teaches in sociology, global affairs, and human rights. He's also a founder member of the Sahel Consortium, a research group focusing on geopolitical studies of the Sahel. He will be telling us more about what he does. But today, I am so grateful, Professor Biniam, for joining me. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Great, lovely. So mainly we were really worried about the Ethiopian foreign policy and what's happening now at the moment in Somalia. As you know, the Ethiopian government, Dr. Abiy Ahmed, started a relationship with Somaliland, and that caused lots of problems around the region. So because of that, Egypt's troops now have landed in Somalia. So now Ethiopian community is thinking whether to stand with the Ethiopian government to fight Egypt, or whether to not fight because it's the government, led war. Whether we can afford it or not, but we're on to this argument, but we don't know. Can we really afford the war, and can we avoid the war? And what do you think of also together the Ethiopian foreign policy?
So when we see the events in the Horn of Africa today, particularly around Somalia, I think it's very important to remember that when you had the new administration, Abiy Ahmed administration, and the new governing party, the Prosperity Party within Ethiopia, come to power, there was an attempt to create a foreign policy, particularly regional policy, that was aimed at cooperation, ensuring security for all without insecurity for any particular country in the region, meaning it's a win-win security arrangement. And particularly this was bringing together Eritrea and Somalia with Ethiopia in the beginnings of this new, let's say, security architecture. So with those hopeful moments, you see now today where you're talking about the possibility of a regional war that will have Ethiopia, Somalia, and perhaps its allies embroiled. And I think we have to ask the question, why? How did it come to this debacle, so to speak? And I think a very important element here is the memorandum of understanding that was signed between the Ethiopian government and the Somaliland administration. Somaliland is it's not a state. It's not recognized as a state. It is part of Somalia. I think your audiences know very well that Somalia has been fractured for over 30 years into small sort of statelets, in many cases competing, and going through very brutal civil wars with various foreign actors playing, in fact, taking advantage of these divisions. In fact, once a state breaks, it's very difficult to put it back together. Libya is a prime example. Libya, a very powerful, rich state, broken by NATO intervention, and to this very day, it's not been put together. So the story of Somalia has been one of trying to put back Somalia together, maintain its territorial integrity, and of course, have its sovereignty respected. Ethiopia could and still can play a very important role as its neighbor. Now, Ethiopia is not going anywhere. Somalia is not going anywhere. They live together forever. And so it's very important to understand that Ethiopia's position in moments of Somali weakness and tragedy has been actually very positive, right? For the past 30 years, Somalis have been able to enter Ethiopia, to live in Ethiopia, to seek refuge in Ethiopia, to travel, in fact, on Ethiopian passports. Ethiopian Airlines has been a very important connector to Somalia with the outside world as well. So there's many positive things that you can see that both Ethiopia does, and that takes us to a different direction in terms of cooperation, neighborliness, and resolving Somalia's long-standing state failure, let's say, problem. The memorandum of understanding, although it's not problematic, you can have a memorandum of understanding for sure. What makes it problematic and what really brought the government of Mogadishu, the national government of Mogadishu, to the forefront was the fact that it offered, right? So Ethiopia was asking for a port access as well as land to establish a navy. And we'll see where, how Ethiopia would get the money, why it's doing these actions itself. And so in return, one of the key things that Somaliland wanted was recognition, recognition of sovereignty as an independent state. And so what Ethiopia was doing was intervening in this Somali process of territorial, right, bringing together and recreating Somalia as a sovereign territory. And in fact, what Ethiopia was doing through this memorandum of understanding, and you can see it from the Somali perspective, was actually attempting to cut and fracture Somalia. The equivalent would be if Tigray, for instance, in the past war, very brutal and ugly war, was being propelled by the TPLF or any ruling party within the region, and decides to secede from Ethiopia and request recognition from neighboring countries, Somalia or Sudan, that would be taken as an attempt to break and fracture Ethiopia. It would also be taken as a gross violation of Ethiopia's sovereignty. And that is the way not only Somalia, but regional organizations, continental organizations, international organizations, even Western allies of Ethiopia, all of them have interpreted the same way. So this was a huge, huge mistake, to say the least. In order to bring these two countries together, you've had Turkey that intervened through about 2 rounds to kind of bring them together. And of course, one of the key demands from the perspective of Somalia is very simple. Do not intervene in Somali sovereignty, but port access to Ethiopia is welcome. Let's have a discussion. Very rational. In fact, if you look at the diplomatic offensive by the Somali president, the Somali administration, it's been highly clear, it's open, and it's very logical, and it's been very successful in putting the Somali position very much to the forefront. It is not calling for war. It is not calling for no access of ports to Ethiopia. What it's calling is very simple: respect Somali sovereignty and discuss with the national government in Mogadishu regarding any major deals regarding ports or, for instance, military relationships, if that's necessary. So in that sense, it's very rational. Egypt comes into the play because what Somalia then has been doing is, again, they don't have a very strong national military. They're still almost in the infancy of controlling their territory, setting an establishment of administration, dealing with Al-Shabaab, a terrorist organization that's been really destabilizing Somalia for some time. And so Ethiopia, as a peacekeeping force, has actually been welcomed in Somalia and has played a very positive role up to this point. But unfortunately, because of this situation, they are requesting that Ethiopia be removed. Rather, what Somalia is doing in order to ensure its national security has been looking for alliances, one of which is Turkey. And so there's been a very important deal that's made with Turkey in exchange for fish and water-based resources. It will provide with some security, particularly of its coastal region. Just to highlight to your audiences, Somalia's coast has been raided by international fishing trolleys, particularly from the European Union and from Asia. Talk about incredible levels of theft. And so Somalia has an interest in ensuring that it's protected in that way. Egypt, as we very well know, and you cannot blame the Egyptians, this has given them an incredible opportunity to actually circumvent behind, so to speak, Ethiopia and the underbelly of Ethiopia. And if it's successful to establish a military base as well as about 10,000 troops, as it's discussed, it could be long term or it could be short term. And so again, this requires diplomacy. It requires diplomacy and direct dialogue with Somalia. And I think through diplomacy, to your question of can war be avoided? Yes, war can be avoided. Very important. But the question is this, and I think we all should ask ourselves: is there an appetite in the Abiy Ahmed administration for peace, diplomatic resolution, or is there an attempt to somehow start or instigate a regional war? And that's a very viable question that one can ask.
Well, people need to actually understand why all these things happening in the Horn of Africa. So it's I'm just reading about it now, even in Djibouti and some part of Horn of Africa. It's literally militarized in those areas. So, for example, it says that Horn of Africa is undergoing far-reaching change in its external security environment, as well as a variety of international security actors from Europe, the United States, the Middle East, and the Gulf and Asia are currently operating in the region. As a result of Horn of Africa has experienced proliferation of foreign military-based and built-up navy forces. The external militarization of the Horn poses major questions for the future security and stability of the region. So there has been quite a lot of bases and everywhere. Even in the Djibouti, there has been quite a lot of now in Djibouti current Red Sea tension caused by the Houthis in Yemen have drawn attention of Djibouti hosting multiple foreign militaries. The US, China, France all have navy based in a small country, with the other militaries also having a presence. The UK opened an embassy in 2021. This is from the Home Office. So what I'm seeing is there has been quite a lot of interest in Horn of Africa. Everybody, even India, seem to be having a base in Horn of Africa. So we like to actually talk about what is their interest. People need to know what is the West or all these countries' interest on Horn of Africa, because it will be affecting the countries around that area.
So the area that is of great interest, the Red Sea region. So if we look at sort of conceptually at a map from the top, which is towards Egypt, you have the Suez Canal, a very important artery of international shipping and trade. And so as we flow down through the Red Sea, you'll see a choke point of international trade, as well as a military choke point as well. So militarily, it's very strategic, which is the Bab el-Mandab, or Gate of Tears. It's only 20 miles across. So between Djibouti, the quote-unquote African side, and let's say Yemen, the quote-unquote Arabian side, is essentially just 20 miles. And so on one side, you have the Horn of Africa, which is incredibly important. It's geostrategically important. It's also economically important, full of resources. It is significant in the broader context, let's say, of discussion of Africa, but it's also flowing into its importance even in the wider Middle Eastern region. So across the 20 miles, if you go across, you have the Arabian Peninsula. One of the sources, concentrated energy, international oil, and energy resources are based there, and that's very critical. So there's a great sense, a desire to control or to have a footprint in Djibouti, in a way, both for military purposes, but also to have greater levels of control over shipping. So when we think about shipping, we're looking at least over 20,000 vessels that go up, through the Bab el Mandab annually, about 1.6 ton of cargo within, let's say, the past 2 years, as an example, right? 12 to 13% of international oil or energy trade is through the Bab el Mandab. And as you can see, in terms of the significance to global, both commodities, commodity prices, to international shipping prices, to consumer products and the prices of consumer products, you see that the Houthi or Ansar Allah government in Sana'a, Yemen, has shown through very, very rudimentary, cheap technology, they've
Mm.
played a significant role in controlling international shipping, right? In
Yeah.
shaping international shipping. So that small country, right, Yemen, by the way, which itself is fractured between Sana'a and Aden, but the most populous part and the government essentially of Ansar Allah has
The
shown.
Gulf Aid give access to Suez Canal, right?
Yes, of course. So in terms of the policy that this group has been following, very much has to do with the war that's happening in Gaza, and it's very simple in terms of the rhetoric that they're using, which is that if the onslaught against the people of Palestine and Gaza does not stop, then those that are shipping allied with Israel or Israeli shipping are not allowed to actually go through the Bab el Mandab and go through the Red Sea. Very interestingly,
Yeah.
no Russian, no Chinese shipping has been impacted whatsoever. In fact, Chinese and Russian shipping is going to be cheaper,
Yeah.
faster, right? So there's an interesting sort of even effect that this is having. Ports like Eilat, which is a southern port in Israel, has essentially went bankrupt. So that gives you a clear illustration of the importance of this strait, the Bab el Mandab, geopolitically, geoeconomically today, right? Ansar Allah has shown you that, right?
Mm.
With respect to even political context that's going around the issue of Gaza, as an example. So there's a great interest amongst various powers to have their footprint. Another illustration, I think, which is important, moving away from the Red Sea, is the wider Indian Ocean region. Again, there is an interest in controlling and having greater levels of power over international shipping, as an example. So one of the countries that has made inroads in that regard has been the United Arab Emirates. So United Arab Emirates is very feisty, right? So it's a oil-rich, gas-rich Emirates. MBZ is the leader and the thinker and the visionary right now. And one of the aims that they have is to become a port power, to control as many ports, both in the Red Sea as well as the Gulf of Aden, and of course the Persian Gulf. The other is to have greater levels of control over international shipping. And so they have now access to Socotra, which is an island of Yemen. And so they occupy that island. And I believe also they have access to, given access as well to the United States. This is a very important island. It's actually strategically located in the mouth, both of going into the Red Sea as well as in the Indian Ocean area. And so you can see the jockeying that's happening regarding that.
Well, it's really interesting. So all these countries are benefiting from that area and resources and everything else. But then when you look at the countries around that area, pretty much dysfunctional, terrorism, poor, often have internal conflict, everything else, really. The least benefited from all these resources is the countries that are around that area. So what do you make of that?
So again, this is not new, right? And so you can look at the Horn of Africa as a case study of a general principle. And the general principle is this: rich country, poor people. And the second is that the closer that one is to a natural resource, it can be a gold mine, it can be an oil well, it can be bauxite or copper. Uh, and here you can think of countries from Zambia, copper, to Democratic Republic of Congo, etc. Nigeria, full of oil. The closer that you are to these resources, the least that you're going to benefit. So the economic arrangement since World War II that has been established is one of extraction of resources from Africa more broadly, and the extraction of these resources in their raw form. So these countries specialize essentially in the extraction, let's say if it's mining, the production of primary products such as cash crops, essentially, so foods and products that are not eaten by the local community, right? And so in many cases, you'll see food insecurity that's then produced, not something that's natural, as an example. So this is again looking at the architecture post World War II, economic architecture that many describe as neo-colonial, right? Which is a way of controlling and shaping the local economy so that it creates poverty, it creates unemployment, it fixes these countries to be primary producers, whether it's agricultural, let's say like in Ethiopia, or it can be Nigeria, which is a powerhouse, but ends up actually exporting raw petroleum products and then importing, right? So it can't even process itself in terms of the So this is again a very problematic nature. Another illustration to give you is Niger. The country of Niger in the Sahel is the source of uranium for Europe and particularly France. And so you can see that I believe the figures, if I have it correct, is maybe 1 in 8 light bulbs in France is due to uranium from Niger. And yet, Niger, 80, 90% is in the dark without electricity, right? Again, this is by design, that arrangement. And so I think when we come into the Horn of Africa, looking concretely, let's say at Ethiopia, the question is always, how is it possible for these countries to develop? So the first idea was that they have to escape colonialism. That means there's the anti-colonial movement and the ability to actually have sovereignty. And all African countries today have sovereignty, nominal sovereignty. The unique case of Ethiopia, it's never colonized, right? And yet it also is enmeshed in poverty. So the same question applies. How can you escape poverty? And that's where it gets very
But do
interesting.
we really say we are sovereign countries because they decide our political decisions? They make TPLF came in power with the help of America here in London, and in other countries they actually decide who comes in power. So do we really think that Africa is free anyway?
It's a very, very good question. And I think the simple answer is the sovereignty that exists is actually the sovereignty of a flag, but not real substantive sovereignty. Any real and substantive sovereignty, and this does not mean, by the way, that the government in power necessarily is benevolent, is effective, is loved by the people, or has legitimacy. That is not what sovereignty is about. Sovereignty is that a particular power structure, right, a state and the authority of that state have the ability to make determinations by themselves. They do not make decisions pressured by outside powers. They are not bending the knee to outside powers. And it's very few countries that you can say are actually sovereign. And those countries, by the way, that exercise sovereignty are the ones that are going to be demonized in international media, and you'll see them demonized. So a great example, Venezuela, demonized. A small country in Central America, Nicaragua, demonized. Cuba, the island of Cuba, to this day, sanctioned. The whole world says it should be normalized and be part of the world community, be able to trade with all countries as it sees fits, demonized. So you can go around the African continent and ask yourself which countries are demonized and which are not. You can go around West Asia and see all of a sudden that Iran has been demonized since when? 1979. Why? Because it's 1953, the democratically elected government, Prime Minister Mohammed Mossadegh, was overthrown by the UK and the US. And instead, a very brutal dictator, the Shah of Iran, was put in power until the revolution of 1979. So from 1953 plus until 1979, the Shah of Iran was the darling. Iran was the darling of the West.
Mm.
But after 1979, it was demonized. Let's go to Ethiopia. When the emperor, the last emperor of Ethiopia, Haile Selassie, was in
Yes,
power, in fact, was supported and put in power by the British. But
yes.
as the sun set essentially on the British Empire, and the U.S. became the dominant power, the key backer for the imperial throne in Ethiopia was the United States. And until the very last moment, 1974 again, and it's very ironic, it's the Jimmy Carter administration. Jimmy Carter, before the revolution in Iran, actually gave a talk, a speech. He visited Iran and said that it's a marvelous country, everyone is happy, it's so peaceful. And after he left, here you have the 1979 revolution,
Exactly.
right? So in the same thing in Ethiopia as well, right? 1974 revolution was one that ended monarchy, brought in a secular government. And what happened since that time? It was a relentless attempt to destroy the state and the regime in that country,
But
right?
that regime didn't have any relationship with the Americans. Isn't why they actually started working with TPLF rebel groups so that they can bring them in power to this
Absolutely.
level. Now they're very family, aren't they?
So it's very interesting because you think, do they have to be antagonistic, right? So the group that came to power post 1974 in Ethiopia, there were only several options. One were students that were primarily organized in universities, but they really didn't have that much institutional power to
True.
take power. So the only institution available at that time was the military. And so young officers, mid-range officers in the military took power, and they were not even sure what to do. They were not radical, they were not leftists, but nevertheless, they adopted some of the popular platforms at that time, one of which was land reform,
Yes.
etc. Right? Another was universal suffrage, the equality of Christians and Muslims. You had another platform which was very key, which was universal education for everyone, and so on. So these are key platforms that were very, very popular, and they won them support. But they had internal communications with the Jimmy Carter administration. One of the officers, Colonel Atanafu, for instance, said, look, we're open to having even a liberal type of arrangement in Ethiopia. We can have a monarchy like the British with a parliament and a government, right? We can do that. So they were open to all types of arrangements. The key thing that really made it impossible was, from the US perspective, was the idea of resource nationalism. What you just asked earlier, Metasebia, which was, why is it that these countries are poor? Why is it that they're rich in resources but poor in terms of its population? Because the resources should not be used for the benefit of the population. So the idea, for instance, of land reform that would be distributed to as many Ethiopians as possible so they can use it, particularly in an agricultural country, was anathema, right, to the US and to the West. Why? Because you want to grow cash crops and you want to have land consolidated either in terms of foreign companies that are going to come there and create factories, but not small plots, small farmers all over the country, right? Everyone having their own pieces of land. That was an element of resource nationalism. It's no different than what got Mohammad Mossadegh in trouble in 1953 in Iran. All he did was to nationalize Iranian oil. He said, this is our oil. We're going to nationalize it, and we use the oil wealth to modernize and industrialize Iran. Resource nationalism is unacceptable to this very day. And so I think that is the context for why you had this antagonistic relationship. And what you pointed out was really interesting. The TPLF and EPLF have Eritrean People's Liberation Front, which was looking to liberate Eritrea, a province, former province of Ethiopia, and the TPLF, Tigrayan People's Liberation Front, based in Tigray, by the way, trained by the PLF, working in a very up and down. Sometimes they're friends, sometimes they're enemies, more like frenemies over the 17 years. Um,
Yeah.
their aims are slightly different, but their goal was to remove the regime in Addis, the Ethiopian. I call it the First Republic. Many people simply try to say Derg, etc., and that kind of minimizes the experience and what the experiment was about. Well, it's really remarkable. The first time that Ethiopia had a secular republic, and so it is the first attempt at having a republic, a secular republic. And you're absolutely right. They were supported. They were supported in terms of propaganda, so Western media. They were supported in terms of arms. They were supported in terms of the pressure that was put on the Ethiopian government at that time, the government of Mengistu Haile Mariam. And not only that, but even just 2 years, just in its infancy, you had the revolution in 74 in Ethiopia. And what the US did was to provide Somalia and push the new Somali government to actually invade Ethiopia, and thereby hopefully destabilize and destroy the new regime. Ethiopia, in return, actually went then to the Russians, and
Yes.
you had the invitation of the Cubans. Without the Cubans, by the way, and I think most Ethiopians do not recognize enough the significance of Cuban um, sacrifice, both in Ethiopia, but as well as in Southern Africa against apartheid regimes, right? In helping to create and to continue African sovereignty. So Ethiopian sovereignty owes so much to Cuban sacrifices at that time. But that was the policy that was used. The policy that was used was to use Somalia against Ethiopia. And then moving forward, then was to fund various types of groups, right? None of these groups were ever considered terrorists. And there's other groups, alphabet soup of different liberation fronts that would engage in different types of tactics. Again, they were never denied funding. So fundings could be raised in the West, funneled to them through formal channels or informal channels, right? So that's the context in terms of the U.S. relationship. But once the TPLF came to power, I think it's very important to kind of step back for a second and say, well, why is a very large, rich country that's across the oceans, thousands of miles away, across the Atlantic, why is it here by the Red Sea and Indian Ocean? Why is it its business? In fact, you can ask the same question and say, why is it in the Pacific? Why is it in the Philippines? Why is it in Nepal? Why is it in Bangladesh? It's everywhere. And this
As
goes to
and
kind
they're
of
everywhere pretty much, really.
this is very important because in many cases when we talk about countries and their foreign policy and their behavior, we think of them as countries, and that's correct. Ethiopia is a country, it's a state. Its political elites think of themselves as a state, and they'll operate in that fashion. What's different about the US, particularly around 1940s and moving forward, is it does not think of itself as a state. It thinks of itself as an empire, as
Yes.
the heir to the British Empire. So when the British falter, it is the US then that takes the crown and decides then to become an empire. So from
Mm.
within the United States, you have intellectuals like Chalmers Johnson, as an example, or Alfred McCoy, the historian, who talk about how this actually deforms what the US was is itself trying to experiment, which is to create a secular republic with a constitution. And so that experimentation in secular republicanism and democracy itself is challenged by this thrust to become an empire, and not just a, let's say, a regional empire, right, within the Americas, but a global empire. And the term that's used in international relations, for instance, is hegemony, the desire to control politically, economically, militarily a region, other states in a region, or the globe. And so the US is exceptional in the sense that for a very brief period of time, particularly after the Cold War, when the Soviet Union collapsed, 1991, for about 10 years or so, for the first time in world history, we had one power, a single power that was a global empire. No other time in human history have we had that. And so it's in that context that you have to think then, what are the US actions in any particular region? The primary drive is to ensure hegemony. The US interest is to ensure hegemony. And it takes various types of actions, political actions, I gave you an illustration where, for
Mm.
instance, it engages in regime change wars, it engages in proxy wars. So, for instance, it is not possible. The U.S. public after Vietnam was very much against war. In fact, the Pentagon called it the Vietnam syndrome. It was considered a bad thing. So for those who see the world as an imperial project, who want bases all over the world, and who have to use the military, they see war differently. But the general U.S. public does not want to go to war, thinks it's a waste of money. And of course, they want their daughters and their sons to be safe. And so this Vietnam syndrome was a big problem. And so what the US administration, over time, including particularly during Ronald Reagan's time, developed was war by proxy. That means you fund, you organize, you train local proxies. In the late 1970s, early 1980s, for instance, you had the organization of a group called the Taliban, which means students. And this was in Afghanistan, right? So they were trained, they were organized, and then they were deployed from Pakistan into Afghanistan. And they morphed and developed into both the Taliban that we know today, but also that terrorist organization called Al Qaeda, or the base, with its devastating consequences to U.S. security, and the innocents that died in September 11, 2001, right? So this is again um, one of the unfortunate consequences of these types of imperial policies. They do not serve Americans at all in terms of economics or even in terms of national security as well. So this drive, this imperial drive, is a problem today, right? As we speak, one of the key concerns, whether it's by authorities in Russia or authorities in China, or those, for instance, that are part of the UN system, is how is it that we can have a world with multiple centers of power, but with a United States that still believes that this is in the 1990s when it had hegemony. It was the most powerful state. What the US decides in terms of law becomes international law, right? It's
Yes.
military,
Yes.
untouched, etc. So it's in that context that we have. So I think the Horn of Africa then becomes very, very interesting because it's no longer just so if you look at the US interest in terms of the Horn of Africa, one, of course, is that it wants to maintain its position. So the way that it's maintained its position and influence, particularly in Africa, is by having uh, states, key states called anchor states, that were dependable. They would be funneled with training, military training, diplomatic support, funding, and these states then were to act on behalf of the US interest in the region. And these states can also engage in their own interest. So, in the context of the Cold War, when you had the demise of the First Republic in Ethiopia, the TPLF comes to power in Ethiopia in 1991, becomes a government in 1993, it was considered one of the anchor states, very important. Rwanda.
Actually, do all these things you've just mentioned, the support to the US government to have base around the Horn of Africa and other African countries, do they actually serve them to that level? The
Yes,
TPLF?
for the TPLF.
Yes, do the TPLF created all this platform for the Americans to control or whatever they want to do in the Horn of Africa?
So it's a complex story, right? So it's an interesting story to follow. If you look from the American side, they need dependable allies. So the RPF, Paul Kagame in Rwanda, becomes the key anchor state to control Central African region, and the Great Lakes. Why? Because that is the source, at least 5 trillion worth of minerals that are under the ground of the Democratic Republic of Congo. And so you can see the process of extraction, the destabilization of the Congo. For your audience, just to remind you, when Patrice Lumumba, again, democratic elected, highly, highly loved, beloved leader of the Democratic Republic of Congo, was aiming for resource nationalism, aiming to use the resources of the Congo to develop the Congo. he was assassinated in such a brutal fashion, both by Belgian intelligence as well as the U.S. Right? Again, this is open document. Open. This is not a conspiracy, etc. This is easily verifiable, right? And so, in the context of this anchor state strategy, Rwanda has played a very seminal role, very key role. It's become a darling of the West, and the Rwandan government has taken license, also has been given space to do all types of things. And if you see Kigali today, it's the
Yeah.
cleanest, the
Yeah.
cleanest capital in Africa, with an incredible investment and so on and so forth. But it gives you that there's a give and take. If you are a good vassal state, a client state, an anchor state, you're also given something in return, and that could benefit the larger country in some cases, right? In the Ethiopian context, there's no question that Ethiopia is a power weight. So even though Eritrea at that time and President Isaias Afwerki was seen as one of the possible anchor states, they were called the new leaders by the Clinton administration at that time. Africa
Mm.
has a new breed of leaders, and that was Paul Kagame, Meles Zenawi, and
Yeah.
President Isaias Afwerki. And they gravitated to Ethiopia for a simple reason. Ethiopia is a giant, both diplomatically in terms of history and its significance, but also in terms of the size, etc. And the working relationship with the U.S. and the government, TPLF dominated, but the EPRDF was very tight. But it wasn't sweet. I've read documents, and many of you, it's open source. You can read it for yourself on the wrangling. The Ethiopians were not easy to simply roll over and do as they're told. So yes, one of the things, for instance, that they did in the region was to try to isolate and corral Eritrea, unfortunately, right? They allowed, for instance, this sanction regime, illegal sanction regime, to be put on Eritrea up to this very, recent moment,
Yeah.
until there was the peace process. Another thing I think that was really a debacle, a very unfortunate one, was the what they called, I think it was the New York Times or the Washington Post described it as a Christmas gift to George W. Bush, the junior, and that was the invasion of Somalia, right? Somalia, for the
Yeah.
first time, again, was coming together. This is 2006. The Islamic Courts Union was coming together and creating a nation state, so to speak, right? Unity, and the Al Shabaab component were absolutely insignificant in terms of the power dynamics in the Islamic Courts Union. It was the entry of Ethiopian forces. By the way, they were supplied, equipped. The intelligence again was provided by the U.S. Right? It's just the
Yes, but
body.
Ethiopian
Where
soldiers were dying on their behalf, on the Americans' behalf, weren't they?
Yes, I mean it's really, I think it's going to be a dark spot, and many have not really looked at and thought about the significance of that. In fact, one of my expectations when I was witnessing that live 2006 was I was really expecting a level of vitriol and animosity that would be created that would transcend states and go people to people. I think it's the again the nature of Somali culture and their wisdom that has not produced that. No Ethiopian has ever said that they've been attacked or they've been targeted in a discriminatory fashion because of the actions that were taken by the government in 2006. That is not recognized today, right? Ethiopians also are very wise. In fact, one of the things to, maybe for a different conversation is the repository of cultural practices and wisdom that is existing amongst people that allows even a certain sense of neighborliness to exist, whether it's within the country or in our region as well. So those are key moments. But also, I think there was other realms where the Ethiopian government of the day, the EPRDF, played a very important role, right? For instance, in climate change negotiations, I think they played a very key role. Prime Minister Meles Zenawi at that time was the key, really, figure
Yeah, he was
representing
the
Africa.
representative of the East Africa, pretty much, isn't it?
Of East Africa, but representative really of Africa with respect to climate change policy. And
Mm.
what the West was trying to do was to get out of their commitments to funding the debt that they owed Africa and other developing countries, right? There's
Yes.
climate debt. And so what they were trying to do was use particularly the prestige that the prime minister himself as a leader enjoyed, the standing of Ethiopia as well. And I think the climate change policy of Ethiopia, again, I don't think Ethiopians understand the significance, at least the experimentation that was happening at that time, which was a green policy, a climate change green policy that was happening, kind of put Ethiopia at the forefront. The green policy, by the way, was not just planting trees. It was a top to bottom envisioning of how do you become green, both in terms of energy, in terms of production, in terms of housing, on and on and on. And in fact,
Isn't it mainly because they're whatever they destroyed in the West that we had to pay the price for? So that's why they have to compensate us.
no question about it, right? So if you look at climate change as air pollution, right, the concentration of fossil fuel pollution, you had the industrialization process, particularly since the 1800s, that was concentrated in the West, right, industrialized countries. So this is really about those that have used fossil fuel resources and polluted the atmosphere, and those that were the primary beneficiaries of industrialization now owe a climate debt to the remaining part of the planet. Why? Because it's privatized benefit, but shared or externalized damage, right? So what this simply means, in very tangible terms, is the effect of climate change. I know we're going a little bit sort of in a divergence, but
Definitely be interested to talk about because you're also expert on it. I'm definitely going to have you again on this one. But then because we're at it now, I think we need to cover a little bit about it.
So just coming back, I think the movement, so the effect of climate change essentially is first and foremost going to be felt by the most vulnerable regions of the world and by the most vulnerable populations within that, which means farming communities, which means women, which means the elderly, etc. And one of the key vulnerabilities is poverty. So if you have infrastructure development, job creation, savings, etc., you're less vulnerable to the negative impacts of climate change in the future, right? So the idea of raising from poverty is one of the most important. How do you raise yourself out of poverty? You need political regimes that have sovereignty. You need space to try to experiment in order how to create value added within your territory. You need resource nationalism. That means your resources are for the benefit of your people, not for the benefit of a small elite within the country or for foreign investors. That is the key kind of model that we have. That development is for the benefit of a small group within a country and for foreign investors. So then you will have a place like Congo, or you'll have many places in the Americas, as an example, that kind of meet that standard. Venezuela is the most oil-rich country in the world, yet the majority of its people are poor. Why? Because again, a small elite siphoned off the oil wealth, and foreign investors were the key beneficiaries. And that is the primary tears that you see over and over again regarding Venezuela. How dare you touch this model? And so that's why.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. Didn't Meles Zenawi secure quite a lot of funding in terms of
Absolutely.
and then we haven't seen anything done.
Absolutely. I think this is really worth its own conversation, which is the Ethiopian sort of, if you look at the state in terms of who's making decisions and how are they doing it, from about 1993, 94, I mean, they're still coming into power. It's about after the war with Eritrea, right? About 2000 is when you have Meles as the equivalent of what Prime Minister Abiy is today, right? It took him about 7-8 years to where Mengistu Haile Mariam also became central, and where Mengistu also replicated imperial times Haile Selassie, right, the last emperor, meaning having this enormous amount of power, centralization of power. So the prime minister's office, as an office, concentrated so much power during Meles's time. It was crafted that way, right? That's a big difference than when you had the 1990s period. Very important. So once that was the case, he had a very important role in designing and shaping economic policy, right? And I think many of us outside the country, particularly many of us that also were looking for greater levels of human rights, sort of political freedoms, tend to look at the state only through that lens. It could be both. Just to remind you, many people here enjoy the United States. The United States period of great economic wealth was during slavery. During slavery, it was a slave state, right? And then the slavery ended not in 1865. There's a wonderful book called Slavery by Another Name. So slavery continued in different forms until about 1960s. So
Absolutely.
the idea, for instance, that this melding together of sort of liberal polities and sort of economic wealth and so on, that's not actually true. You can go to South Korea, you can go to Japan, on and on and on as we go. So the key thing here is that Meles, not just Meles himself as a prime minister, but the Ethiopian ruling elites, and I think it's important for us to think of them in that way, that collective. Even though now they're bickering and they're pointing towards each other, but that collective was successful because of its alliances. But their alliances was not only in one basket. They're very, very, this is about assessing risk and assessing opportunities as well. So the opportunities that started to open up was the possibility of having access to resources, access to markets from Asia. One of the primary countries is China. But Ethiopia also went after Indian investments. Ethiopia was also going after investors and markets in the Middle East as well, right? And so the Europeans and the Americans were very important because of some of the development aid and access to international credits as well that they provided. And it was there, right? So just to give you a sense, between that period, between let's say 2002 and 2019 or 20, and it's important not just only think of Prime Minister Meles or TPLF only. Think of as the political elite collective that was ruling that period, borrowed about 14 to 15 billion dollars. And when they borrowed 14 to 15 billion dollars in that time period, and I'm looking at only borrowing from China. You can look at the breakdowns. There's a wonderful data site where they break it down for you in terms of sectors, how the money is used, what was it used for, and you'll see that it's primarily an infrastructure investment. So it's one thing to talk about corruption, and there's no question there was corruption, right? There's no question. But the question is, you can't hide all that money, right? If you say that you've done something, where is it? Well, telecommunications, electrification, power transmission lines, hydroelectric power plants all over the country, with the exception of Gard. That's a different story of how the money was raised for that. The rail system for the first time that connected, right, Ethiopia to the Red Sea and giving it access, part of the BRICS system, the single largest development project of the past 10 to 15 years, about $1 to $2 trillion already, is the BRICS Belt and Road system, primarily driven by China, right? And so again, it's about taking opportunity. And you had this still going on. It still can go today, by the way. We're just simply looking at that period. So what the ruling elite in Ethiopia were doing was actually trying to hedge their bets. They would take something from the West and they would give something in return. They were building relationships with Malaysia. They were building relationships with India, building relationships with China. In fact, the one with China was a very enduring relationship, very key. And the thought was, of course, to transform the country through industrialization. And you may ask why. Well, one of it could be self-serving, right? Any government, how does it gain its legitimacy? Not through elections. Elections are meaningless. You're elected to do something. It's the actions that you do. Think of Western liberal democracies today. You have elections every few years. There's politicians, sometimes the same, other times different personalities, yet the result is the same. The problems persist. No solutions are offered. The standard of living of people is going down, going poorer. Jobs are scarce. Inflation is higher, on and on. And it's a crisis. So it begs the question, how do governments actually gain the legitimacy? by being effective and by providing something to the public goods, right? And I think that's a barometer that's kind of very, very useful for us, right?
Well, we can see some other time what they have done actually in terms of environment and the rest of the things.